we got to like scale it back a bit, but I do feel that there's a lot of potential for growing into interaction styles and ways of doing things that will, I like to kind of say, empower more users, empower more people. So that's what our fundamental goal is to make technology adapt to people rather than having people adapt to technology.
Welcome to The Future of, a podcast by Fresh Consulting, where we discuss and learn about the future of different industries, markets, and technology verticals. Together, we'll chat with leaders and experts in the field and discuss how we can shape the future human experience. I'm your host, Jeff Dance. In this episode of The Future of, we're joined by Jakob Nielsen and Marc Wallace to explore the future of UX design. Jakob, we're honored to have you on the show. I've been reading your articles and books and thought leadership for, it seems like 20 years now. So you're a present mind in our voice as we think about the UX profession and the thought leadership around the space and the thinking and the guidance. And Marc, it's great to have you as a UX director here at Fresh and as a leader. Want to start with some backgrounds. Jakob, can you start with just telling the listeners a little bit more about yourself? I know anyone in the UX space knows you, but for everyone else, can you give us a bit more on your background?
Sure. Thanks, Jeff, for inviting me. It's great to be on the program here. I've been doing UX work for almost 40 years now. And for the last 24 of those years, I've been with Nielsen Norman Group, which is a company very specializing on user experience that I co-founded with Don Norman. So that's why it's called the Nielsen Norman Group. Before then, I had a variety of different jobs. I was a university professor. I worked at Bell Communications Research, which was the telephone company research lab. And I also worked at Sun Microsystems, where I was a distinguished engineer, which is sort of the person at the company kind of responsible for thinking about usability and how to be honest, how to make Unix easy to use, which was I wasn't quite successful in that, to be quite honest. But that was the, I guess, main reason that they hired me.
Got it. I think I noticed that you had, 79 US patents. I'm assuming those are all around usability, how to make the internet easier to use.
They are very much focused from that period when I was at Sun Microsystems, because before then, user interface inventions were actually not considered to be patentable. You had to have a physical, like a mousetrap type of thing to get a patent. So I definitely invented or thought up many, many, many more things than those exact patents. But for most of my career, it was not patentable. And to be honest, after starting our own company, we're more focused on, advice as opposed to actual product development. So patents are really just from that kind of 4-year period. Otherwise, it could have been many, many more.
Well, I noticed you're an author of 8 books. I know I have some of your literature, and I've definitely been reading mostly your articles recently. But I thought it was cool that Bloomberg cited you among the world's most influential designers, and the New York Times called you the king of usability. I think we've kind of considered you at Fresh like the Godfather of UX. Essentially, you and Don, who coined the term, if I got that correctly. Yeah, that's great. Like I mentioned, I think I've written 50 UX principles in our history or blog posts ourselves, and we're often citing you, citing your thinking. So thank you for your thought leadership. Marc, over to you. Can you tell us a little bit more of your background?
Yeah, been in interactive design for, I guess, a little bit over 20 years now. Started off in print and various sorts of production as I was sort of trying to be a musician at that time. I worked in Los Angeles for about 10 years with various agencies, doing a lot of movie sites and Flash. A lot of people might remember that phase in history, which was fun. Been with Fresh for about 7 years, doing a lot of enterprise application work, crossing over with our hardware teams and, getting into, interactions that happen with robotics and out and beyond that. So lots of fun and exciting challenges coming up.
Awesome. Marc's definitely been a kind of stalwart leader here and always does really amazing work. Marc, you also do something kind of fun on the side. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I was alluding to my early stab at trying to be a musician, which can be difficult. But we made a CD back in the 90s that actually went underground, and then turns out it became a cult classic and was selling on eBay, I think most recently for about $89. So yeah, so somebody's making money off the ones we sold a while ago, and we'll see how that works out. Eventually we'll re-release a new mastered version that will actually make a little bit of money off us. But yeah.
Nice. And you're still in a band today?
Yeah,
right?
Still playing with some of those guys, and some metal projects, and then another band called Stout Pounders, which is a Celtic rock band. So kind of like Flogging Molly, Dropkick Murphys, things like that.
Nice. We'll have to figure out how to weave that back in. But to start with, you've been a rock star designer here on our team. Jacob, just for fun, what are some things you do for fun? You're obviously such a big thought leader. Tell us more about the fun side of your life.
Well, I'm afraid I don't play music other than on the CD player, I guess. But no, I do a lot of reading, to be honest, and it's sort of opposite genres almost, because it's kind of science fiction about the future, and then actually about history as well. So one of the most recent books I read was actually Julius Caesar's book on the commentaries of the Gallic Wars. So that was quite interesting to read, like a more than 2,000-year-old book, and it's quite interesting actually. And then I like to travel and have fun and all of that. But I don't really have so many like hobbies other than actually doing my work. So I'm sorry about that.
You do amazing work, and it's clear that you're passionate about this space because you're such a clear voice for the industry. So it's awesome.
And traveling,
and I can see how maybe traveling and reading can tie into that, and shape perspectives. I've really enjoyed some of the analogies you've given, in your speaking. So I wanted to reflect on today and a little bit of the history before we jump to the future and get your thoughts there. So Jacob, if we can start with you, this is obviously, there's been a massive progression in this field. Can you tell us a little bit more about the history of UX design before we go into the future?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I started myself in 1983. And at that point of time, I think there was about 1,000 people in the world that I would say like really did UX. Of course, there are many, many more people doing like graphic design and so forth, and or programmers who were making applications and having a user interface like as a side effect of the implementation. But that's not what we consider to be UX design. So there was very small. Today, I think there's maybe about 2 million people in the world So doing this. So just during my career, this area has increased by a factor of 2,000, which is not 2,000%, but a factor of 2,000 or 200,000%, if you will. So huge growth. But obviously, I was not the first one. So I personally kind of trace it back to around 1950, where Bell Labs started what I think is probably the first kind of real UX type of organization to design telephone systems. And their most famous design is the push-button telephone, or the touch-tone telephone, as it was called. So the layout of the keyboard. And if you notice, that layout is actually opposite of what the traditional layout was for calculators. And there was many, many, many other designs that they considered. But then they actually did user testing and found how people could enter phone numbers faster and with fewer errors. Those are kind of the two main criteria. And it was not the one that they showed to people, which one do you like the best? That was not the one. And this is one of our very, very important lessons. You cannot get a good design by asking people what they like or what they prefer without using it, just by looking at it, because people just don't know. And, this design has been used like at least 1 trillion times, and it's since it was rolled out by Bell Labs. And, the world has saved, I think, like at least 10,000 person years. So this is like getting that right has been worth a lot. And of course, you can sort of say, well, even before then, there were human factors people, and you can trace it back hundreds of years if you really want to. People were thinking about how to design things right. But I kind of say around 1950, Bell Labs, to me, is the beginning of designing, user interfaces with user needs as like the leading guiding light. And then it's grown and grown and grown from there. And I don't think we are at all done with that growth. I think we're still only scratching the surface, actually, but it has grown a lot during my time, for sure.
Great. So So what is UX design? If we'd ask that question, there's lots of terms now floating, new terminology, but I think it kind of comes back to this core. I know your partner, Don Norman, coined the term. What do you guys consider UX design? You just talked about UX testing as an example, but how would you define it?
Of it? Yeah, that's an element of it. But I mean, I have sort of two different definitions. So one is the so-called elevator speech, which is, I say, we make computers easy to use, or we make technology easy to use. I think that's sort of the shortest definition. The more elaborate definition, which is really goes back to Don Norman's original work on this, is that it is the totality of the interaction that the user is encountering. So it's focused, the name says it actually, it's the user experience. I mean, we have another term called user interface design, where you're designing what's on the screen. And obviously, teasing those two apart, that's like you can spend hours discussing that. It's not so important, really. But it's really the perspective. So we are looking user experience, UX. We're looking at it from the user's perspective. What is the user's experience? It's certainly, a lot of it is driven by what's on the screen. I mean, the UI design is crucial, but it can also be other things. It can also be what preconceived notions people arrive with. So what has been generated by, first of all, their use of a lot of other things. I have something that I call Jacob's law of the internet user experience. And Jacob's law says that users spend most of their time on other websites than your website. And so when people get to your website, they already kind of have expectations from all these other potentially thousands of sites they've used before. And that becomes part of the user experience because they expect it to work in a certain way. And if it doesn't, even if it's a brilliant idea, it's likely will fail.
I've been reading some of your other laws, and I remember one. I remember seeing a graph maybe 15 years ago about, it was about testing, and user testing being an aspect of user experience design. And I think it was the notion that after 5 users, you start to get a marginal benefit of return from a testing perspective. And so, you can go test 100 users, but you might get the most outcomes from just 5, and then you start get some other issues. Do you still see that to hold true?
That is absolutely true. And it actually goes back to one of the things we say when we do usability studies. We always tell the test participant, the user, we are not testing you, we are testing the system, we're testing the design. And so it's because of that, you don't really need that many users, because these users are kind of confronted with an artifact. And of course, in principle, there's millions of ways you can use that wrong, but there's some kind of main ways you can use it wrong. And you tend to find those, so observe those after a few users. Now, I should say what you don't get. So we don't get any statistics. With 5 people, statistics are just invalid. So I cannot say if I see 1 out of 5 users doing something, I cannot say 20% of users will do that. Well, it was 20% of the 5 people, but honestly, anybody who's ever had a statistics course knows that the margin of error will be so big that it's irrelevant. But what I can say is this element of design trips up people. Now, depending on how expensive it's going to be to fix it, I may need more than that. I may need to know that this is something that's going to be a problem for more than 10% of the customers, or more than 80% of the customers, or whatever, if it's really, really expensive to fix. If it's really cheap to fix, just knowing that it's bad for some people, that's enough to fix it. So it depends on what you're talking about, how much more information you need. But if our goal is I like to think about this as debugging, right? Just like a programmer, you are looking at your code and see if there's an error in the code. If it's wrong once, it's going to be wrong the next time as well. And the same is true here. I mean, if some users have trouble, guaranteed more users will have trouble. Now, exactly how many more, that I cannot say, but enough that I want to fix it for sure.
It was a nice piece of work that I think has impacted lots of user testing in the future. You mentioned saving time with the telephone design. Well, that principle alone probably saved people a ton of time to think about the marginal benefit of return from usability studies. Not saying that you wouldn't do more if there was more risk, et cetera, or if you wanted more statistics. You might not discover more things, but I really appreciated that. Marc, for you, you've been in the space for 20 years. What are some of the pain points or problems you see in the field of UX design today?
Yeah, I would say a pain point I probably encounter frequently is getting access to the right data or the right users when you're doing tests or surveys, particularly with enterprise apps. Sometimes it's a very select group or within a company. It could be doctors, lawyers. Healthcare provides its own set of hoops you got to jump through to get real data, with HIPAA violations. And so, yeah, you kind of have to improvise a little bit and figure out different ways to kind of extract what you think is a pretty representative set of information. But that's probably the first thing that comes to mind, is just trying to get access to data that's actually helpful to the decisions you make.
Mark, you're really right on that. And this also shows many of these things that really stable in our field, because that exact same complaint I could have made 30 years ago. There are just certain disciplines where it's just hard to get hold of people. But that actually is one more reason why qualitative research is so important, because you can get, as we just were discussing, a very large amount of insight with a very small number of users. You're just going to squeeze the juice out of that some more when it's harder to get users. And it's very easy to get users if you're talking about a broad consumer market. Then you can kind of afford to, I wouldn't say waste. You should never waste people's time, but you don't have to be as conscious about it.
Jakob, you mentioned 2 million kind of professionals in the UX field now. It's grown exponentially since you've started. Where do you see the majority of work happening today? Is that still websites and applications, mobile applications? Obviously, the UX field is broader than that, and we do work that's much broader than just that. But if we think about the majority of the work, is that kind of where do you see it? Where do you see it being mostly in?
Yeah, I think if you talk about majority, then I think it's some form of web, even though not necessarily just websites. It can also be various types of applications that are cloud-based and so forth. And I would also include mobile, because, to me, it's actually not very different. It's all graphical user interfaces, and the screen is a little bit bigger or smaller, and you have it with you, you don't have it with you. Those are important points, but still, in the bigger scheme of things, it's about the same. But it applies to, first of all, anything that has a user interface, which is a toothbrush these days. But even things that don't have necessarily an interactive interface, but things like road signs or wayfinding in a hospital, getting to, particularly if people are confused or sad or for some reason upset. There's a lot of situations like that where it's not really a user interface that says you don't touch it or change it, but you still have to make sense of it. And so sense making is a big part of what we do as well. But yeah, the majority, in terms of more on this than in the other buckets, I think the majority would be any type of sort of internet oriented thing.
So I think, what is it, 90% of work is now done in the cloud or supported by the cloud. And
yeah.
And so if we think about where work is being done and this, profession exploding, I could see where they're hey, we're making computers easier to use, the interfaces of those computers easier to use. And there's a lot of us on a small computer or a large computer or a laptop computer, right? So that resonates with me. What about, if you think about the history here, and we've seen so much change in the last 20 years with the advancement of the cloud and mobile and the interactive web. What are some things we've kind of learned from the past that we hopefully don't repeat in the future? Technology has changed us maybe for better and for worse, but any thoughts on some things that, okay, we've learned that we hopefully won't repeat that in the future?
Well, I don't know if we will. I actually think we probably will repeat it. That's one of the sad lessons about the field. I feel like every time there's a new technology, the same story happens again, which is that people get very excited about this. We can do these new things. Then they do them and they fail because normal people cannot understand the design. They have various tripping points. Even the latest one I just looked at was this so-called, what is it called? Meta or metaverse or whatever they call it. And a lot of these ideas they sound good, but then the actual implementations are such that they just are honestly so difficult to use. And we've seen this, we saw it with personal computers, we saw it with website, we saw it with mobile, we have seen it with intelligent assistants, the voice-driven assistants and all of that. The watches, every new generation, and again, we're seeing it now again with artificial, what's called virtual reality, augmented reality, those type of systems. They all have their, promise. but they're all done wrong the first few attempts.
They're not getting it right at first, and they're probably not spending enough time in the UX field with doing enough UX testing to kind of inform the all the interface and the experience.
Because those people think it's great because they work on it. And because if you work on it, of course you understand it, and of course you like it, and of course you think that what it's doing is something that's wow, so great. The normal person, one more thing, and it's more difficult for the outside person as well. It's one of the big lessons of our entire history.
It's kind of like that poster.
If you work on a project, you can understand it. If you're an outsider, unless it's very polished, people are going to fail.
It's kind of like that poster in the background that says you are not the user.
Yeah.
What are some of the methodologies or principles or techniques that sort of have withstood the test of time? I asked you originally about the usability marginal benefit of return after 5 users, and you're like, hey, that's still relevant. What are some other things that have sort of withstood the test of time? I'm curious of both of your thoughts.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of the research methodologies definitely continue to be about the same. Now, there's also changes. So, for example, that we talked about doing user testing, and one thing we do a lot these days is remote user testing over the internet. That technology was not really there in the old days. We had to grab people into the lab and sit with them, which we also still do, but not as much. So, but that basic idea of just watching your customer, watching your users, see what they do, making a prototype or mock-up of the design before you implement it, so you have not wasted, hundreds of programmers' time for months upon months to make a feature that users cannot understand. Those type of ideas have honestly been the same for my entire career. And I predict that they're going to be the same for the next 40 years as well. But I also wanted to be you to think that I'm thinking, oh, nothing is ever changing. It's all the same, because there's honestly been a lot of progress in user interfaces during this time. I mean, if you think back, anybody who's old enough thinks back to things like DOS or Unix or the entire text-based mainframe text-based interfaces. They were truly terrible. Then kind of the PC interfaces were just terrible. They were not like as bad. They were better. And then the early websites were in fact bad, but then kind of even just the middle ground of websites were already starting to be better. And the modern ones, the better ones anyway, are getting to be kind of like pretty good. And the same is true for mobile. Like the first mobile apps were really bad. You had this fat finger problem. You couldn't touch anything. And they've sort of started to understand that and making them better. So I think that and this is also echoed, by the way, in the masses of people using computers, which used to be relatively few people. And now in at least rich countries, it's a very large percentage of the population. So that is only possible because the computers have become much easier to use. I mean, they're not what I want them to be, but I'm very critical, but they're much better than they used to be.
Yeah, I echo a lot of that. I think some things that'll change a little bit about getting some of that user feedback as things becoming more physical with virtual reality, and how do you capture that? It has been nice, especially the last few years, being able to still conduct interviews and some testing remotely. But yeah, nothing beats getting in person and really watching a person and how they act with, different things that happen in the environment around them that you can't really capture in this, two-dimensional, help the camera is capturing everything that's going on around that person. So yeah, for certain things, it's just, always better to see them in person.
Makes sense. Let's shift to the future a little bit. Jakob, you have done this sort of 100-year span time frame that I've talked about before, 100-year view on UX that starts in 1950 and goes to 2050. What's in store for the UX field in the next 30 years? If roughly 30 years, 2050, tell us more about what you predict for the future.
Well, yeah, I predict enormous additional growth. So I always said that in my time, it's grown by a factor of 2,000. So in that sense, the factor is smaller because I'm predicting another growth of a factor of 50 from 2 million to 100 million people. But of course, in terms of absolute numbers, this is like 98 million more people. So that's a huge growth. And the reason I do that is I really feel that what we are doing is becoming more and more core part of the world economy. And in the old days, it was a matter of like making farming better, And I'm sure this will still happen. It's just not my area, but I'm sure farming will still get better. But or mining or assembly line, making an automobile, those type of things. They've always been important. They will continue to be important. But relatively speaking, the knowledge work, the intellectual work, the information-oriented things. I mean, various people could say we're in a knowledge economy, information economy, or whatever, but I really feel we are. Not just the economy in terms of like producing, but also the economy in terms of consuming. Because there's only like so much bread you can eat, or so many, steaks you can eat, or whatever. Like, so as farming gets better and better, we can't eat more anyway. And the same is true for how many cars do you want, and how many this or that physical thing do you want. But we can always want things to be more pleasant, more engaging, easier. So that's why I think a lot of the growth is happening now, and even more so in the future. And also, this is a global phenomenon as well. So we have to remember there's still a lot of countries in the world that are more like middle of the road or even poor. And those are going to get richer and richer and richer. And the countries that are now middle, in 30 years, they'll be rich. And the countries that are now poor will in 30 years hopefully be middle class. So I'm expecting like a lot more affluent people who will really be very demanding in terms of quality. And so how do we deliver quality? I mean, we do it by this UX work. And that's why I'm thinking that there's a need for dramatically more people doing this than we have now.
That makes sense. Technology is changing super fast, and it has changed super fast. But we also anticipate it to continue to grow really fast. Fresh is actually now in, AI, robotics, AR, VR. We've done industrial autonomous cars because we're trying to stay ahead of how fast things are changing. And yet we know humans don't change as fast as sort of the technology does. So how do we see, the UX field sort of evolving with all of these new technologies that are coming out, some of which don't even have screens, so you don't have that interface, that different type of interface, I guess. But how do you see the kind of UX field evolving with all this new innovation that's going to be coming in the next 20 years? So yes, more designers, but do we think that the practices, the methods need to change, or the field needs to change at all with all this new tech?
I mean, I think you're right that we will divorce ourselves more from the screen. I mean, the graphical user interface was honestly one of the really big advances in usability. It's so much easier to deal with things when we can see them rather than have to remember them. This is actually one of our human factors principles, is that human memory is really weak. And so if you can show things to people so they don't have to remember them, this is vastly an improvement in usability. But that said, we can't always sit in front of a big computer screen, right? And so there's a lot of things that are becoming more interactive, becoming more computerized. And so the user interface will more be around us. It'll more be the world that's a user interface as opposed to just your computer screen. And I still honestly believe in the same fundamental methods of watching users behave and act in that world. But yeah, the actual design principles will certainly have to be very different, because we cannot use these principles saying, well, no, make a search box in the upper right part of the screen. And a lot of those guidelines we have that are great guidelines, but apply to a certain representation of the interaction.
It's been interesting to watch voice AI, how rapidly that's evolved. Have 3 billion devices with voice AI, and that being a common way for us to interface with information today. That's been fascinating, I think, for the UX field as an example. But all voice, our eyes, being a key thing with sort of the future of the AR VR world. I just was trying out, one of our clients is OVR. It's a smell. It's a smell factor for the augmented reality, virtual reality devices as well. And so we're like tapping into these different senses. And it seems like the human factors aspect of UX might become even more important for the future, given that we might not have, all the interfaces, or not as much interfaces with new technologies, as some of the technology starts to disappear a little bit.
No, I think you're right, because one of the key things about the graphical user interfaces it can show you options. So like a menu is one of the classic things in a graphical user interface. And so Whereas for a lot of these other interfaces, you have to basically be right. I mean, you have to like show, not show people, but let's say have people smell or hear or whatever, a much, much smaller number of things. Because you don't have that. The visual scanning is very, very powerful, and that's one of the reasons the menus work. But yeah, a menu I mean, people hate these phone trees, like for this press 1, for that press 2, and for such and such press 25 or whatever. I mean, they are just insufferable to use because scanning doesn't apply to an auditory interface. And even less so to a smell interface. And so you're right. We have to be much more accurate in our design. And so the graphic user interface has saved us in many ways from our inability to be perfect designers. I mean, I don't think there's anybody who's a perfect designer in the world, right? But we'll have to become more perfect when we have these other types of interaction channels.
One of the things we've been talking over here at Fresh is about using a combination of methods, because it can be really efficient, for example, for voice, for search, and for getting the information in, but it's not super efficient for getting information out. And so we have a robotics platform called Harmony, and we've been discussing, well, it's efficient to get information in if you're, let's say, navigating a robot somewhere, but to see what's happening, if you're trying to hear back from audio, you could scan in seconds what it could take a minute to tell you, right? And so that sort of hybrid of thinking about like when to use different experiences and when to design with different inputs, I think is going to be more important for the future. Marc, what are your thoughts on how things need to evolve, or what are some of the game changer things you see for the future of UX design?
Yeah, I mean, just that what you were just talking about, bringing in the senses of smell, things starting to, traditionally you were just eyes and keyboards and trackpads, but now, it's not just that. We're bringing in smell. You have hearing, you have AR, VR devices. Now you're talking about physical gestures. And that sort of brings in, the human factor of being aware of, more physical accessibility issues, beyond like the plethora of vision problems that a lot of people have. So yeah, I think it just kind of expands into further understanding, the human restrictions and when to account for that in design.
This is a question I had for you, Jakob. Like, do you think the next generation of tech advancements will make the future of computing more natural, or do you think we're going to be, just more distracted essentially with all these different devices and ways to interact with computers that are in IoT devices but mobile, and screens that are everywhere? What are your thoughts on like making the experience with computers more natural? How does the new tech sort of enable that?
Well, I feel that what you're pointing out is definitely a risk that it just becomes more distracting, more overwhelming, more like you're bombarded on all channels. And it's very similar to you are at if you're in like the physical reality world, but you're going to some place like Times Square or any other like major downtown place in the big city, and all these things are flashing at you, and the taxis are coming, and you are at dire risk of your life if you misstep once, right? There's definitely risk of that. And so I think attention management is going to be a really big concern. And we have to remember people are very limited in how much they can take in. But at the same time, I also believe that there's a lot of potential for making it more natural. And we just basically know that most humans are not great at dealing with abstract information. And this is, again, this like you are not the user kind of points, because I think most people who are watching this episode are probably in the very high end of the population in terms of cognitive skills and abstract thinking and all those type of things. So we may not realize how hard it is for the majority of people, but there's been like very thorough studies of these things, and turns out that it's very, very limited percent of the population who can actually capable of doing like really advanced use of computers with the kind of the current type of computers. And one really big study that was done by OECD was said 5% of the population average over the OECD. And then there are some countries like Singapore and Japan was 8%. And, that's nice bragging rights for them. But honestly, whether it's 5 or 8, you do the opposite math, right? It says that on average it's 95%, and in Japan and Singapore it's 98, 92%. It doesn't even really matter whether it's one or the other. In any case, it's more than 90%. of the population cannot do this. I mean, they can do simple things, which is why e-commerce works. If you see something you want, you can click to buy it, or you can scroll through a news feed. And simple things people can do, but complicated things they cannot do. And it's just because that's not the way, I mean, and it's not because 90% or 92% or 95% of people are incapable of functioning. I mean, clearly we can see this. I mean, so it's the case that the vast majority of people are able to drive a car, go shopping in the supermarket, deal with their girlfriend. I mean, whatever things. Right? I mean, all those type of everyday activities, not everybody, but most people can in fact do them. So there's clearly a disconnect here. And so humans are evolved to live in that physical world and understand a certain way of doing things, but only to a certain extent. I mean, again, not if there's thousands of people banging things at us all the time, or blinking things and behind us and besides us. So we got to scale it back a bit. But I do feel that there's a lot of potential for growing into interaction styles and ways of doing things that will, I like to kind of say, empower more users, empower more people. So that's what our fundamental goal is to make technology adapt to people rather than having people adapt to technology.
Makes sense. I really like that stat of okay, if humans are only doing 92 to 95% aren't doing really complex work with computers, that's a great promise for truly making computers easier to use and kind of doing more of the advanced complex work, right?
Exactly.
If we can adapt them to the humans, then they can do even more advanced complex work as we continue to evolve, right? And that being sort of the role of, yes, technology will get more automated, but as it does, it hopefully with good UX design, right, it gets easier to kind of manipulate and utilize and do more advanced functions. And so we carry that need forward with us, right? That's awesome. Marc, what are your thoughts? How do you see the UX design field evolving, and how does that relate to kind of making things easier for humans?
Yeah, I think it is getting out there more and watching people. I think that assumption that people are just going to get this because I get it is you still see it all the time, actually, and it's always fun to kind of show people a user test video and reveal that it's not as easy as you thought it was, and here's some places where we should probably focus some fixes. So as far as evolving, I think it's just it's going to be some different sorts of test methods to capture how struggles with VR, the new technology that comes out. We're going to have to adapt our testing methods to capture the big picture. It's a lot of the same, but some shifts to adapt to the new technology that's coming out.
One of the trends we've been seeing recently has been just this decentralization of data, been the Web3, blockchain, all that sort of stuff. Jakob, do you see that impacting the UX design field, or is that just more kind of behind the scenes?
I mean, to a great extent, it's behind the scenes, but it does also raise some additional issues. Like, for example, do people know where things are? I would say mostly probably not. Do they have to know where things are? Hopefully not, I would say, because it's too difficult. But those are definitely issues we didn't have in the past. I mean, if you had before the internet, if you had a PC, you knew all your data was on your own local drive or your floppy disk, even if you go back far enough. So it was easier to understand what was going on. And the more steps and layers you have, the harder it becomes. And this is a particular problem when anything goes wrong, because it's almost impossible, even for somebody who knows, I know a lot about computers, actually, so it's very hard for me to understand what's wrong when something breaks. As long as it all works fine, no problem. But so the ideal there is actually that things break less often. And so this is a great example of how something that you would consider to be truly back end, like the exact code and stuff like that, impacts user experience, because when there are bugs, when things go wrong, they go down, they break. endless confusion involved. And people start then doing things to overcome the problem, but they will often be wrong things because they don't understand what went wrong. And that is really terrible. So having more stable, solid technology that doesn't break as often would be a vast improvement in user experience, actually, even though it's not a design, an interface design, it's a back-end engineering design problem. But that, and of course, all the security issues and the endless things compound to make things more complicated. And they have a bigger impact than just that one isolated spot in its own right. Like when you can't log in, that snowballs those type of issues. So there's a lot of things that impact total user experience, which is what we want to optimize.
That's interesting to think about how, back end can reinforce obviously the front end experience, or, something going down could damage trust, which may be a critical aspect of using something. That's helpful. As we think about, I mentioned technology kind of has a life of its own, and I think UX has done a great job helping us focus on the users, which, impacts humans and impacts humanity. What are some challenges that we need to be working on as we think about the future to solve for humanity and not just users? And I think this recent focus on like inclusive design has had us thinking a little bit broader than just, the traditional like user personas and user testing, and start to think about like, oh, humanity is getting impacted here. What are some thoughts on, again, the challenges we need to be working on from a humanity perspective?
Well, there are many. I also don't think we should over-exaggerate our own role. I mean, there's some certain things that we probably can't really deal with, like let's say, risk of World War III as an example. It's definitely something I worry about.
It's becoming a real present reality, potential reality that people are talking about.
Now
right?
Hopefully people are watching this in 5 years and the problem will gone away, but actually not. Right? There's still going to be some other problems, right? But yeah, I don't think we should expect that we can solve everything. But that said, there are certainly things that we can either solve or at least help improve, right? And one thing is a little bit of a traditional human factors problem, but I think it's the aging society I think it's a really big one, because that's true in almost all countries, that bigger and bigger percentage of the population getting older and older. And I feel like there's actually two aspects to that. And one is really just the traditional usability issues of just like using bigger fonts and simpler workflows and stuff, such that old people can have an easy time using those designs. And that's a disgrace that's not already done, because we know how to do that. And then there's a second one, which I think is more complicated and difficult, which is how to use technology to overcome the degradation of the brain by aging. And a simple example of that is the memory problem. So anybody who has not forgotten where they left their car keys, there's two reasons. Either they don't own a car, or they're not 50 years old yet. Otherwise, memory is just known. Memory does kind of degrades a bit. But I think computers have perfect memory. So we should have ways of have this human-computer symbiosis of having the computer take over some of that responsibility, have the humans do more of the things that they are good at. There's honestly been not that much good work done on personal information management. Ever since the web came out, the web really changed our focus a lot to being just put out more information, as opposed to really understanding and dealing with our own information. So that has been progress, and that has not been as strong. There was very much more interesting work kind of done in the late 80s than has been done more recently. So that is just one example, but there's a lot of other things as well. So I think that we can make the aging population still feel active and do things, because a lot of the physical health problems are not going away. I mean, they're always sick people, which is another question. But generally speaking, older people tend to be much more fresh now than they were in the past. But they're still old. I mean, they're still aging, and so we still need to have the computer be better able to sort of magnify them and amplify them and make them more creative and so forth. So that, I feel, is like a really big challenge that is not, as far as I can see, not being done a lot. I mean, most design kind of interest is in how to design for young people, not how to design for old people.
Marc, what are your thoughts about challenges that we need to be working on, and also, what are some of the big topics that we could cover from that can make the world a better place?
Yeah, I think actually I was watching a video. I think it was one of yours, Jacob, where you talked about that population shift where there's just going to be a lot more older people as opposed to more younger people, which has kind of traditionally been the pattern. So I think that definitely comes to mind, and watching how they interact with things. You have a different population now that is becoming old, that has grown up with computers, whereas people like my parents did not. They've adapted over time. So I think it's just interesting to watch how, as Gen Xers or whatever they're calling us now, get older, are they just completely out of the loop on the new technology that's coming up, or do they are they more, do they have a greater ability to adapt to new technologies that come out? And how do you design for people that, like you say, just, the memory starts to go a little bit, and eyesight and things like that. So just being cognizant of, not forgetting those people, and making sure, if they're even remotely going to be part of your user set, then you really need to work their needs in there.
Any other thoughts, from a macro perspective about how, we can be more intentional for the future, given all we learned from the past? Jacob, thoughts from you?
Well, I mean, mainly I'm a very optimistic, positive person, but one of the things that has sort of been disappointing to me, I guess, is a lot of sort of social media for the last 10 years or something. So that could be one area one would hope one could have learned from the past. And I'm sure, there's a lot of great, both actual benefits and also perceived or hoped for benefits. But they've also been overshadowed by various downsides as well. And so that would be one area I think that there would be potential for learning from the past and doing better next time.
Yeah, it's definitely, I think we've become more divisive as a result of some of the media and some of the technology. And so how do we bring people together more and think about that more intentionally? That's definitely on our minds. Let's move into just a couple closing questions. Jacob, what advice would you give for someone interested in the UX field? It's obviously, you mentioned it's going to be a growing field, but what advice would you give for someone that, this sounds interesting, I'd like to get involved?
Well, of course you have to be interested in all of that, but if you are, I think it's going to be a great career. And the only thing to do is to get going, get into it, as fast as possible, because this is an area where you mainly learn from experience. There's absolutely some theory, and it's worthwhile reading some books. You mentioned I've written many books, and then taking some courses, all those type of things, all very good. I think if you just try to do it on your own, you're going to go and make all the mistakes that I made 40 years ago. And why do that? So learn from what's already known. But the truth is that it's not that much. It's not that much theory. It's good to know, some psychology, some research methods, and some design, principles and whatever. But mainly it's a matter of actually doing it and then learning from those projects and doing better next time. And so my main advice is just get going as fast as possible. And it's of course, the exact advice will then depend on the person's circumstances. Like, is it someone who's like in high school? In that case, maybe you could advise that they try to get an undergraduate degree, not a graduate degree, undergraduate degree in UX, and then go and get a job. Are they already in the job market? In that case, what I actually usually say is, look around where you are right now and see if you can twist your current job to become a UX job, and just take on some of the low-hanging fruit, because particularly in a company that does not do a lot of UX work, there's going to be a lot of terribly designed internal applications that very little work can make them vastly better, and which will be very visible to management, which will then hopefully now make them give you more resources to the next project and so forth. So I think if you're in this place already, try to see if you can make it work where you already are. But yeah, if you're completely new, then what I did, but this is back in the 1970s. This is so long ago. I did all these things like getting a Ph.D, whatever, but that's honestly, it's not worthless, but it takes too much time. It's better to get going faster.
Marc, what are your thoughts on for someone that's interested in this UX field? You've been in it for a while.
Yeah. Get exposed to as many things as possible. I mean, not just education, but getting out there. If you have opportunities to travel, do it. Expose yourself to as many cultures as possible. I think just understanding more humans, the better, more perspectives. I know throughout my life, I've had opportunities here and there, and you don't realize it until you go through it, that how that can impact you. And your perceptions on, not everybody sees things the same, and just understanding that principle alone is can be pretty powerful as you approach your design.
Jakob, for you, any other closing thoughts as we think about the future of UX design?
Well, I mean, I think it honestly will be it will be glorious. There's always resistance as well, and what I feel is like, don't let that get you down. Like if you're a place where there's resistance, push them harder, and if you keep pushing and it still doesn't work, then maybe get another job. But that should be the last choice. I mean, don't let, because if you look at the bigger history, and again, don't look at the history. History is not from 1 week to the next, or 1 month to the next. And so you have a brilliant idea and it's going to be shut down, or you do user testing and you discover like a major thing that needs to be fixed, and engineering manager says, we don't have time, we're going to ship next week. Yeah, so there will be those type of setbacks. They just happen. But if you look at it in a longer period of time, over years, many years, we are up, and we are getting more respect. We're getting more budgets. Maturity in organizations are going up. It's becoming more international. The ultimate point is the actual quality of the user interfaces that are shipping is going up. All those things are getting better and better and better. And then there's small setbacks, but don't focus on the setbacks, focus on the bigger picture. And then it's just really great.
Awesome. Thanks so much for being here on the show, both of you, and for your insights, your wisdom, your experience. Huge gratitude for that, and for joining us today, and for just sharing thoughts on where we're going and how we can continue to impact that with intent. Grateful.
Well, thanks, Jeff and Marc. It was a great discussion.
Thank you.
The Future of Podcasts is brought to you by Fresh Consulting. To find out more about how we pair design and technology together to shape the future, visit us at freshconsulting.com. Make sure to search for The Future of in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. Make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any of our future episodes. And on behalf of our team here at Fresh, thank you for listening.